All right, so great sermon. Thank you. How many of you have ever sat in the transepts over there to watch a sermon? Yeah. If you haven't, you need to, because you can't not pay attention. So. Are you on? That's true. Yes, that's true. That's true. Okay, so I love this first question because I also can relate to it. So it says, well, I really wanted to get on my feet and dance, but I just couldn't. What's wrong with me?
Well,
so I know what it is for me.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that person. I mean, but somebody asked me actually on the way out, why didn't you get up and dance with us? And I said, well, because if I get up and dance, then everybody who's not dancing is going to feel bad because I'm dancing. But I think we just, I think we're conditioned to feel a certain way in this space. And if we're not used to dancing in church, it can take a lot to get us up and moving. Now, I know some of y'all are very used to dancing in church and dance every Sunday, regardless of the musical style. And I'm glad about that. But I think just for a lot of us, it's just not something we're used to. So it feels new, it feels uncomfortable. And I think we just need to admit that to ourselves and lean into it a little bit. And hopefully there'll come a time where we feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when we have done diverse worship in Heaton Hall, there is a level of freedom of movement of all types. We've had coffee in Heaton Hall during worship, and the kids are moving all over the place, and so there is that. There's an element of freedom there that is not in
I
this
do see
space.
people dancing more when we're in Heaton Hall, but I think that begs the question: what is it about this space that makes you feel like you can't dance? And whatever it is, we need to figure that out and get over it, right?
Amen. All right, so here's the next question. Should we start community gardens in the areas/neighborhoods of need?
Absolutely, that's a great idea. There are some folks who do farm-to-table sort of community gardens in what we call food deserts now. And there's groups in Charlotte that do that put together community gardens. There's also an initiative in some urban areas in the Midwest, Detroit and other places, that have built incredible community gardens in urban environments. So there's a whole sort of rethinking urban space as a space that feeds people, and not just as concrete and steel, but as a garden, one big garden that feeds everybody. So it's going to take some urban planning and some creative thinking and a little bit of imagination, but I think that's a great idea.
And I would say that if you know of one, just join in. And I mean, I think it strengthens the ones that are already present, and then you can get some ideas of how to start one on your own. All right. Quote, I have problems with the image of the good shepherd. The crowds were all aware that sheep were a food crop. They were used for milk, wool, and flesh. Other metaphors for protection and care exist. Why shepherds? Why sheep? Okay, that's the first part. Is there a meaning of the cost of following the shepherd? Are we to be the sacrificial lambs?
Well, so the shepherd imagery, as I mentioned, is complex and doesn't have just one meaning throughout the Bible. Long before Jesus ever applies it to himself in John, we have this image that I mentioned from Numbers 27 of Joshua being anointed as king or anointed as the leader, following Moses in the wilderness so that the people are not sheep without a shepherd. So the metaphor is very old. It's almost, ancient. You have to think about what metaphors would have been available to people living in an agrarian society. So this is why the Bible is filled with metaphors about landowners and vineyards and seeds and sowing and farming and sheep and animals that they had there, hens and other things that were available to be used as metaphors. They didn't have all the metaphor things that we have today, in an agrarian society, it would be very common. This is why we have, of course, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. So the application of the shepherd imagery to God is very, very old also. And there's almost a thing about that psalm we don't always think about, is that when the shepherd imagery first comes, it's always about a national leader. So then when you're applying it to God, you're saying, no, the national leader is really not the true authority in the world. God is more important than the national leader, no matter who the national leader is or how our relationship to that national leader is. So there's this sort of transcendent move that you make when you start calling God the shepherd. And always the imagery is of care and protection and feeding and nourishing, right, and even rest, lying down in green pastures, restoration, the restoring of soul. So there's a lot of really good imagery there. Then, of course, in the New Testament, you see Jesus now using the phrase, but Jesus is drawing on a prophetic imagery where I've mentioned in the sermon, Ezekiel and Zechariah are really railing against the false shepherds, or what they call worthless shepherds, who were the ruling elite in Israel at the time that were oppressing the people through, as always, heavy taxation, war, violence, exclusion, radical inequality, et cetera, debt, poverty. And so Jesus is drawing on that prophetic imagery when he's out in the wilderness with the poor and hungry masses, saying, these people are out here because they're sheep without a shepherd. They have been exploited. He's drawing on that prophetic imagery. Just as the people of Israel were exploited under Ezekiel and at the time of Ezekiel and at the time of Zechariah, Jesus is saying now, the people are exploited, the people are being harmed, the people are like sheep without a shepherd, and you, disciples, you have to become the shepherds of these people. You have to step in, and so we're going to figure out how to take care of them. We're going to figure out how to feed them and care for them right here, now, in this place, in this time. So I don't think that, then of course later then shepherd imagery becomes the image of Jesus. I had a fan as a kid in church with Jesus the shepherd on it. I'd wave myself with the fan, in church when it was hot and they weren't paying for the AC. And the imagery gets a little smarmy if it becomes almost too pastoral. One of my favorite things that I've ever been given as a gift is a picture of Jesus with a shepherd's staff beating off a wolf. Right? So another reminder that a shepherd was not just a provider, but the protective side of the shepherd is beating the wolf off with the crook, right? So Jesus also did some of that, right, with the Pharisees and the scribes and the ruling elite of the day. Now, then the image of lamb, not so much sheep, but lamb, is used as a sacrificial imagery throughout the Bible. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, etc. Jesus refers to himself as the Lamb of God, the sacrificial imagery. That sacrificial imagery can become very problematic. It's interesting that when Jesus calls us to follow and to pay the cost of discipleship, saying, no one comes to me, has to take up their cross and follow, give up their life, all that stuff. There's not a reference to sheep imagery there. So I don't know that there's necessarily a sacrificial lamb imagery when it comes to the cost of discipleship. But I think there is a cost. And I was just talking to a Hindu monk and asking him, what is spirituality in the Hindu tradition? And he says, all spirituality in every tradition begins with the idea of sacrifice. That sacrifice is the core of all spiritual traditions. I don't know if I buy that, but it was his that was what he was saying about sacrifice. So I don't know if the image itself is necessarily negative, but I do think we have to be careful with language of sacrifice, especially when we apply it to people who are already in situations of oppression. You would not say to a battered woman, right, who is suffering abuse from their husband, go back and be sacrificial. No. And you would also not say that to a community suffering oppression, be sacrificial. And so that can become harmful, toxic theology if it's applied to people who are already in the situation of abuse. I think usually the language of sacrifice is applied to those who have much. What does Jesus say? To those who have been given much, much is required.
So I'm wondering now, is it too big of a leap to imagine that we could be shepherds as well as sheep?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, I think that's because we are also sheep, right? We're called to follow, which is very sheep imagery. What does he say? My sheep know me and they hear my voice in John. And if you've ever been around shepherding communities, the sheep do know the voice of their shepherd. They will respond to the voice of their shepherd without, and they can distinguish the shepherd's voice from anybody else's voice. Because sheep are actually much smarter than we give them credit for. We have this image of sheep of being like blindly following, right? Which is not actually accurate about sheep, to be honest. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the story of the one that got away if they were all just so obedient. But this whole image we have now of calling people sheeple just because they believe in one particular political perspective or something like that or whatever, that's not healthy. I also think it kind of destroys the image that we have in the Bible that can be a very powerful image. Sheep follow, and the image in the Bible is of something that chooses to follow. And then, but I think Jesus is also here saying, as disciples, as leaders, as people who are called, and who have this sort of situation of being close in proximity to Jesus and having resources, it is up to us to figure out how to also lead. So there's both the sheep and shepherd, and I think there's an egalitarian spirit there of we sometimes are in the role of sheep, we're sometimes in the role of shepherd. We all have to have somebody to follow. We all have people that are looking to us as leaders, looking up to us. So we're always in this dynamic, fluid relationship of sheep and shepherd. What does Bob Dylan say? You got to serve somebody. Everybody follows somebody, whether they think they do or not. And then Jesus says, well, you can't serve God and money. So a lot of us are serving money and not God, right? And so there's all this kind of imagery about who do we follow, who do we serve, and then where are the places in our lives where we lead. And I think we get images of both. We get the image of what it means to follow from the sheep, and we also get, if we're careful about it, a good image of how to lead from the shepherd.
It also makes me wonder if there were like shepherd fraternities, like the shepherds are all going to gather for their annual shepherd conference, and they're going to. Like it sounds silly, but I'm really being, realistic about thinking about, getting together and kind of sharing, best practices.
Yeah, the way that would have been done in that time was more like a guild, but they would gather. But the problem with that is that shepherds were the common folk. Shepherds were the peasantry. And actually, there's a lot of writings in the intertestamental period and in Jewish writings about how shepherds are not a worthy occupation. Think of them as like sort of day laborers, and there was a trade, there was a skill, a craft to it, but it was also one of the occupations that was for the poorest of the poor. So those who are out watching their flocks by night, when in the Christmas story, are the very poor and marginalized in their community of the day. So it's also interesting to see the way the Bible draws on that imagery. And remember, King David was a shepherd, right? Or at least we're told that was his occupation before becoming king, which is also where the shepherd imagery comes from, as well as kingly imagery applied in reverse to David. So there's a lot to be thought through there with that metaphor.
Yeah, I have so many other ideas, but I'm going to keep going through these questions. All right, so we're going to stay with sheep. In terms of, quote, satisfying the sheep, end quote, how do we transform the national dialogue from superficial capitalism versus socialism to discussing smart government, one that best serves the needs of people in the 21st century and recognizes our, quote, common humanity, end quote?
Whew. Is that Devin again?
No.
Oh my God.
I will not reveal the name, but I will tell you this is a
I'm surprised that's
this
not
is
Devin.
a newer comer among us.
It's a really good question, and it's a hard one and a complex one. So there's no easy answers here. The first thing to say is, yes, the whole debate right now about socialism, capitalism, as it has been since the 20s, when there was actually a real socialist party that had a candidate running for office and almost got elected president. We forget that time in American history. But since then, there's not really been a viable socialist candidate for a presidential office, nor has there been a very viable socialist party. There are socialists who get elected, but the idea that there is an ongoing dialogue between two equal concepts in America is ridiculous. You know, talking about socialism and capitalism is like like a conversation between America and Guam. The power dynamic is out of place. You know, people in America worship capitalism as religion, not just an ideology or a thought process. It's a religion for many. And there are books and books and books on this. And we have to be careful when we talk about capitalism that we don't always mean the same thing. There are some who have a critique of capitalism at its very foundation as being anti-human and anti-equality, and there are many books about how it is very much anti the Gospels and anti-Jesus. At its root, like there's no way to implement capitalism in a way that is holy according to a lot of people, or that is equitable or healthy. There are others who believe that capitalism has spiraled out of control and become what the French call capitalisme sauvage, or savage capitalism, a kind of capitalism that is ruthless at this particular stage. I'm more inclined with that particular perspective. I think I have some trouble with certain ideas about the foundation of it, but there was a time when capitalism was working for the majority of Americans, if you were to take, for instance, the time of the New Deal. Now, we have to know that at that time it did not work for Black Americans, it did not work for people of color, so we just need to say that right out of the gate. They were cut out of this time of plenty in American history, which is why things are still the way they are today. But in that time, leading up to World War II and afterwards, we built America that we have today. We built the suburbs, we built the middle class, we built things that did not exist. You remember the Great Depression was right before that. This was an effort to bring us out of the Great Depression. We had the highest tax rate ever in American history at that time. We complain about taxes all the time, but the way that they were implemented at that time made people more equal. It was a time of the greatest economic equality in American history. And also the greatest, just for people, it was where, people were getting loans just for being GIs, zero interest loans, GI Bill, housing, all kinds of things that we had access to at the time. Now, like I said, people of color were cut out of it, so it was not equal across the board. But it was a time when, somehow, we made this capitalist economy work for more people than it ever has. Since that time, American inequality has gone gangbusters. It is now the worst that it's ever been in all of American history. And you can track how that happened. There was a concerted effort by corporate leaders to attack New Deal policies. There are 1,000 books on this. There was a combination of corporate business leaders and Christian pastors that got together preaching against communism, and alongside that, anything that was a New Deal policy they were able to attach to communism, and then they rolled back everything that the New Deal had done. And then it continued to go from there. Once they got rid of all the New Deal policies, then they continued to go after other things. So there was, deindustrialization, deregulation of everything, disinvestment in all public anything public, right, that would sound like socialism, including public education, public parks. So it's the kind of thing where people think, we don't have socialism in America, we have capitalism. No, we have a combination, right? We have public parks and public schools. Those are both socialist. And then we also have private schools and private parks, right? That's capitalism. So we have a combination. But we also disinvested from all public good except the police. That's the only thing we kept funding at an exorbitant level. So now we have communities all over the country who have million-dollar police forces, and their public schools are trash, right? And they don't have public parks, and they don't have anything for their people except for the police, which we know, lands on white and black people differently. So this is what's happened in America. So to kind of compare capitalism and socialism, you have to go back and look, where are the times where capitalism worked for the majority of people? So the question says, well, how do we create a system, a government that works for more people? You've got to balance power, and you've got to give power back to the people, and you have to take it away from the corporations that have exorbitant power. This is not going to happen easily because the corporations own the politicians, and through policies that the corporations have put in place, they can own them on the right and the left, because they can give so much money. And you can't get elected without money in America anymore. That's just not possible. There's no way to get elected to political office without millions of dollars. Well, where are you going to get those millions from? You're going to go to a corporation in your town or your city. They're going to give you a donation. And then when you get elected, they're going to come calling, and you're going to have to do their bidding, or you're never going to get elected again. So until we have a generation of people who are willing to get elected to one term, right, and get unelected the next term, because they have done the right thing for that one term, that they will not get elected. A whole generation of people okay of getting elected for one time to try to change things so that they will actually be changed, then nothing's going to really change. I mean, there's too much money in politics. I could go into all the reasons of that. The corporations have too much power. I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, we're looking at billionaire corporation owners blasting themselves off into outer space because they don't have anything better to do. Right? They're not paying their workers' wages. This is what I was trying to say in my sermon. They're not paying a living wage to their workers, right? And so now we have space tourism instead of people having a living wage. That's ridiculous. It's obscene. But the reason that somehow we're not, like, people are not up in arms is because of the ideology of capitalism. We're all potential millionaires, and so we love the billionaires, and we never critique the billionaires for anything that they do, because we all hope we're going to become them, at some point in time. So I think we need a change. We need a new imagination, and we need. I thought, in some ways, I thought maybe COVID would be enough of a crisis, and there have been some things that happened during COVID that, to me, point to the fact that we're starting to see that this economic system isn't working. The fact that we had to give payments to people, right? Why did we have to give payments to people? Think about that, for instance. I mean, and it goes back to this was one of the first times we've done anything like that, right? And now we're doing the child tax care credit, and there are people calling for this guaranteed income. I was on a call with Goodwill this summer or last summer, and one of the experts on economics in the country and what would help the poor, Mia Birdsong, argued for a guaranteed income for all Americans across the board. Why are they arguing that? Because the economic system is broken, and it's not going to be fixed in time to help people. And so how else are you going to solve the problem of hunger and poverty and people not having anything to eat or being able to survive? And I think COVID has exacerbated that, but it's also made us think, well, how do we fix this mess that we're in? So I see some hope on the horizon for some changes that may come forced by necessity. But what do they say about power? Power never concedes anything without a demand. It will never concede without a demand. And if you've got all the money and power in the world, are you just going to give it out to anybody who comes to your doorstep and knocks and says, please, sir, may I have another? No. That's not how it works with power and money. People don't do that. So it has to be demanded. It has to be a movement of people and power to demand from those who have more to give some back, to make it better for the rest of everybody else, to close that gap. Honestly, really, the only thing that's going to do that is taxes. And I know we get all crazy and worried about taxes, and there can be exploitation through taxes, but all you'd really have to do is tax the top 1% of people in America a little bit more, and it'd be enough to take care of everybody. But those are the people that own all the politicians and own all the corporations and have all the power, and they're not going to let the laws get passed. That's where we are. And so until something shifts with that dynamic, it doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, left, right, we're still going to find ourselves in this situation. Should I be more hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of hoping for a very clear homework assignment that I could go home and do this afternoon. Okay. How can we develop a spirit of compassion in our lives? And they actually wrote out the Greek, which I did not read because I cannot. And they did own that they had to look it up. So kudos that you looked up a Greek word. So, how can we develop a spirit of compassion in our lives?
Yeah, so the Greek word there, splachnizomai, or splachnizomai, has a bunch of G's and CH's in it. It's a very challenging 4-syllable Greek word and a fun one. So thank you for saying it with me this morning. And it doesn't, we have translated it to mean compassion, but it really is like to be deeply moved in one's body and spirit with empathy for the needs of another. And I think we're severely lacking that in our society. One of the things that what happens whenever I talk about things like capitalism or socialism or whatever, or race, is the quick, easy answers. I listed some of them that we want to go to instead of just being empathetic with the needs of folks for a minute. So for instance, the quick jump to, well, why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Or the quick jump to, why don't they just go out and get a job? There was a great podcast for those of you wanting to go deeper on capitalism, socialism, the history, on the Throughline podcast for NPR. Does anybody know the Throughline podcast? It's a great podcast, amazing. You can listen to it anywhere you get podcasts. They have a whole 2-3-part series on capitalism, and they have people of different perspectives on there. And the one guy who's kind of arguing for capitalism keeps saying, it's better now than it ever has been. And if somebody has a problem, I would just tell them to go out and get a job. And if they don't like the job they have, to go get a different job. And the whole time he's describing that, you're like, well, there's some truth to that, but it's also very calloused, right? It doesn't deal with the reality of life for many. There are, how many people in our country are formerly incarcerated because of the criminal justice system being the way it is? How hard is it to get a job after you've been incarcerated? You ever tried? It's hard, really, really hard. And how hard is it to hold down a job and take care of your family if you have a mountain of debt? There are people coming out of like Brown and Harvard with $200,000 of debt and an anthropology degree. What the hell are they going to do? Right? Where's the unless they become a professor of anthropology, what are they going to do for a living? How are they going to make? They're going to be working at Starbucks. I can't tell you how many people with master's degrees and PhDs I run into working at Starbucks, waiting tables. It's amazing how the education system and the economy are not matched up together, not working well. How many people are loaded with mountains of debt? There's a lot of people in prison just because they can't pay their fines. So they're locked in prison just because they can't pay the fines that were put in place for them. They're not there because they necessarily did anything wrong. They have to pay a debt to society. It's a debtor's prison. I mean, so we imagine that somehow, what about if somebody doesn't have a car in Charlotte? Tell me how you could live, even here, and work uptown without a car. The bus route is terrible. There's no public transportation besides the bus because we didn't invest in rail lines when we should have years and years and years ago, which means that's exacerbated the affordable housing problem because you should be able to just live in Mint Hill or Belmont and take the train in to work every morning. But we don't have trains yet, like they do in Atlanta or Washington or Detroit or New York or Chicago or many of the other cities that are as big as ours. So it exacerbates the problem. If you can't drive even if you get the job, you can't make it there. You can't get there. And then you have debt continuing to mount up. You got to find somewhere to live. Right now, the living wage of what people would have to have as a living wage to afford an apartment in Charlotte is something like $20 to $25 an hour or something like that. Because apartment, the rent is just too high. The rent is ridiculous. So when we just quickly say, just get a job or leave the job you have and find a better paying job or an easier job or whatever, it's just, there's no empathy there. There's actually not just a lack of empathy, but a lack of a systemic analysis of what's really going on. So it's not just lack of empathy, it's also ignorance, kind of combined together. And then we just say, well, pull yourself up, but why can't you get a job? It's not that hard. I did it. I came from poverty, all this stuff. And then when you add race, the complexity of discrimination and oppression, I just think it's much more complex a situation than folks find themselves in. So I think we need to have more empathy, and part of empathy is understanding. You know, when you are empathetic with someone, you want to know how things got the way they are. Why are they the way they are? You know, and how does it feel? And how can I be there for you? What does it mean to be there for you in the midst of that? Be with you. Be in solidarity with you. You know, and it's sort of like in the story, the disciples are like, well, you know, why don't we just send them away? Let them go get the bread for themselves. You know, they can walk. I know they've been out here for hours and hours or days, and they're hungry. Just let them walk. They got legs, some of them, you know. And so there's a callousness in the disciples. I think the disciples were, of course, very tired, but there's just like a general lack of empathy there. Meanwhile, Jesus is like buckled over in compassion. This story wants us to imagine him like almost holding his stomach. He's so moved by the people's needs. Meanwhile, the disciples are like, send him away, you know. And so then Jesus says, no, look, like let's imagine a different world, a world where we already have all we need right here together, you know. Like in this room right now, there are people here with tremendous wealth, and there are people here in this room who are very poor. And if we were all out in the desert somewhere, and even if y'all didn't bring any crackers or fish with you this morning, we could pool our resources together, right? We could all take out all the money we have in our pockets and we could put it there on the table. Even if y'all only live on credit, we'll cover you. We're going to put it here and we'll put up a pile of cash, and then we're going to take that cash and we're going to go out and we're going to buy a meal for everybody in this room. I bet we're going to be all full, and I bet we're going to have leftovers. That's the miracle of the story. Not some kind of magic multiplication, but the idea of economic sharing, true economic sharing, which is the roots of what communion is supposed to mean in the church. That's what communion is supposed to be about. The same thing Jesus does at the Last Supper, he does in this text. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and divides it amongst the people. Communion, the Lord's Supper, this image in the wilderness, it's about economic sharing first and foremost. It's a story of how the community of God should live. Don't worry about the billionaires blasting themselves off into space. If we could figure out together here in this space how to live together in solidarity and love, then we could be an image to the world, right? We don't have to worry about necessarily the billionaires. We can tell them, you keep doing whatever you want to do, right? Or we can critique, we can prophetically witness to them, but we can live differently and create an alternative economy right where we are. And that's the gospel. That's the good news. That's the kingdom. So I think there's potential here if we don't think always so grand to imagine that we have to solve. I'm not on the earth to save Jeff Bezos' soul. Thankfully, God did not give me that calling. I'm not here for that, right? But I have been given a call to be with other people and have other people save my soul. So we come into this together and we can create the alternative right here.
The whole time you were sharing that, I kept coming back to this phrase that a mutual friend of ours has been using in sermons lately. That is, where does it hurt? And it has caused me to ask myself that a lot more often about others. Mm-hmm. Where does it hurt? Mm-hmm. Because sometimes it's as simple as trying to imagine, where does it hurt?
Yeah. Well, just quickly on that, everybody goes through things. I preached on pain a couple weeks ago, that very topic, and everybody's going through something, especially with COVID. We're all going through something. Most of us don't even know what our neighbor's going through, right? So that's another reason for the empathy and the compassion. However, we also have to be people of faith who are discerning enough to know that if my basic physiological needs are met, then I am in a better place than most of the world, including most people in Charlotte, right? And that means that my mission and my calling is different than most people in Charlotte. I have a different calling because of where my social location is. And so the same, It's sort of like, the person who has food, water, housing, and gets an adequate amount of rest because they're not having to work ridiculous hours just to get their job done is better off than most people in our city. And therefore, we need them to use their extra time and money to help out the rest of us. That's what it means to be in community, in a true place where we're always working for the common good. Those who have, give so that those who don't. And sometimes that changes throughout the course of a person's life. Somebody who has now may lose it all, right? And then they're going to be in need. We've had that happen in churches. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a church where somebody who was very, very needy, and the church was giving them money to get them by in a life, having a lot of challenges, later became a tithing member. Or vice versa. Somebody who was a tithing member found themselves in a situation where they were in need of the church to help them out in life. We don't know what's going to happen. None of us know what life will bring, what kind of challenges we'll face. This is why we need to be a part of communities where people will care for us regardless of what we have, regardless of how much we can give, regardless of how much money we've got, resources. So anyway, I think that's important.
Okay, we've got two more.
Okay.
And then we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to try to decipher handwriting on this. Practical advice on how to, I'm not sure of the word, but I think what they're trying to get at is live out the sermon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I feel like I've kind of covered some of that.
Yeah.
Can I give any other practical advice?
Well, it might help if I do this next question.
All right, let's put it all together.
How do we encourage ourselves and others to believe that we can make a difference in this world?
Well, first of all, not be despairing about the situation I described. It seems a little hopeless when you think about it in terms of like how much power and money corporations have. I think if you look at the text and you look at Jesus' time, it was just as hopeless then. Can you imagine what it felt like to be not only exploited by your own people, but to be living in a time when you're occupied by the Roman Empire? And every time somebody in your community would get up the guts to rebel, they just killed you all. There were something like 100 rebellions between the time of Jesus' birth and his death. 100 Jewish rebellions in Jesus' lifetime alone. Even more if you start counting back before he was born, between the Maccabean revolt and Jesus' birth. Hundreds of rebellions, Jewish rebellions. And every time, the Romans would come in with the 10th or 12th Legion and just slaughter them. One time, they hung on a cross 1,000 people on the road from Tiberias to Sephiroth. And so when you think about the cross, Jesus grew up with that image of the cross. When he's saying, take up your cross, that's what he's talking about. So this idea that like Jesus didn't live in a hopeless time, it's crazy. There was nothing more hopeless than the Roman Empire. That was a hopeless, hopeless moment. The Jewish people had no chance. And yet, Jesus cast an imagination, a version, a way of living in that time, in that moment, that was so powerful. It was bigger than the revolution of an empire. It was bigger than a military revolution. It changed the whole world, right? Out of that came hospitals and monasteries and universities and Western civilization. Not all good. Let's be honest, not all good. But lots came out of that. Lots came out of it. And so it's a reminder that, even small things like a poor Jewish prophet who got killed by the empire has the power to change the whole world, right? So what do you have, 12 followers and a couple of other people around, and they all ran away at the end. There was nobody. There's so much there to look at and think, how did that become what it became? And yet it did. And so it's a reminder that even small little acts as families, as individuals, in our workplaces, in our homes. One of the things I always say at the end of what does it mean to be white is, what are you going to do in your sphere of power and influence? First thing you have to do is understand your sphere. And then the second thing is you have to understand your power in your sphere and how you can influence it. And then the next step is to get some courage to do something radical in that space. And I think that's probably the best practical advice I can give.
Yeah, you quoted Tutu, so I'm going to quote Tutu, that every week when I would end a video recording for the kids during COVID, I would end with, what are you going to do today to bring God's dream for the world true? And then the way I started closing my whiteness groups was by saying, remember, you have within you all the gifts needed to bring God's dream for the world true.
Couldn't say it better. That's great.
Good, since it's the first time he's hearing that's how I end my sessions. All right, well, any other comments you have before we say goodbye? No,
just really grateful. I thought today's service was just so powerful. I'm grateful for the music, grateful for you all. Thanks for staying for Talk Back, and thanks for your questions. I hope you'll keep up the great questions.
Absolutely. So thanks for entertaining me in the hosting, and y'all have a great week.